Hey everyone, today I want to talk about the T5577 chip. Now we use this chip in some of our products like the XCM and Next implants. And the reason this chip is interesting is that in the low frequency family of transponders, so this is the 125 kilohertz family of RFID tags and transponders, typically you'll see a lot of these kind of cards used. So this is like a card here with some numbers printed. This is the ID number of the card printed in a decimal format. You'll see HID type cards or badges. There's a little lanyard connection there, or key fobs, something like this. Now, when these kind of cards or fobs are operating on 125 kilohertz, that's interesting because usually it means these cards are not secured in any way. Any reader can read the ID number or just look at the number, but any reader can read any of these things. So there's no like hacking or anything that has to be done. But what makes it interesting is that whether you have like an EM card, an HID prox, an Indala key fob, or an AWID key fob, they all operate on the same frequency, but they operate slightly differently. So the way this card stores its ID number or serial number and communicates it to the reader is slightly different from how this card, HID type cards, communicate it, and these cards, AWID or Indala. So they're all slightly different, but they all communicate on the 125 kilohertz frequency band. So what's very interesting about the T5577 is that when it comes to products that we want to put in our body, something like this, you want a chip that's going to be able to be reprogrammed not only for the ID numbers of any of these types of products, the key fobs or badges, but you also want it to be able to change how it communicates that ID to the reader. And the T5577 chip is very interesting because it can be reprogrammed in that way. So whether you have an EM card or an HID card or a key fob from AWID or what, as long as it's 125 kilohertz and it's not using some kind of specialized security, which, to be honest, most low frequency access control cards or badges or fobs don't use any kind of security, you can, typically speaking, clone not only the ID or serial number of that device into the T5577 product, this is an XEM here, but also change how that T5577 represents itself or communicates that data to the reader to emulate exactly an HID prox or an EM. Now what's interesting, or I guess, kind of a limitation, I guess, is a chip can only have one serial number at a time. So, and likewise, it can only operate in one mode at a time. So if you want to set up this XEM to emulate and clone the ID of this EM card, then it's going to be that. And it's going to be just like this EM card. If you clone this ID and operating mode to the T5577, then it only works as this kind of card. When you do a copy or clone process, you are telling it to emulate this card exactly. So any compatibility issues or being able to bring, this kind of card to multiple readers, the only way to really do that is to ensure that the reader can read the card, so not just the ID number, but the way the card communicates, and the system is programmable, meaning like you can tell the administrator of that access control system, hey, I want my ID number added to the system. And in that way, in theory, you could basically, clone this card into your implant, and then take that ID number to multiple different doors or systems or buildings or businesses, and say, "Hey, I have my own ID. Can I put it, or can you put it into your system for me?" And generally speaking, it just registers as another card under your name in the access control system. So that is in theory how you could do it, but you cannot copy multiple types of IDs or operating modes into the T5577. It just does one at a time. So let's take a look at what you might use to do that copying. So we're going to move this stuff out of here. This here is a Proxmark 3. It's a particular kind of utility device. It's very utilitarian. And you'll see there's this antenna structure here. That's for high frequency, which we're not talking about. And this is the low frequency antenna. This is the quote-unquote easy version of the Proxmark 3. There are many different hardware versions, but we sell a Proxmark 3 in the easy kind of configuration. It's very cheap for one, and also we've pre-programmed it with some very useful firmware. So this device is not typically known to be user-friendly, but the firmware that we are loading onto it has a development cycle that's very rapid, so it's improving constantly, and it's very user-friendly. The focus is to make it as user-friendly as possible. So we really recommend getting this device from our website. I'll put the link there. But how you would use this essentially is the first thing you would want to do is you would take your card, if it doesn't have the ID numbers printed on it, you take your card and you would do a read or a scan. So you get the ID number from the card and determine what kind of card it is. Once you have that, then you would place either the reader, if you have something implanted already, you'd place the reader up to it. But you want that device, you want this antenna coil to go perpendicular to the implant. So something like this. You want to be able to have the length of the implant cross over that circle antenna so that it's about halfway in and halfway out. That's going to give you the best coupling, magnetic coupling with the device. So once that's done, you would do a clone operation or copy operation, and you would tell it what ID number to take on, and also the method that you would use to do that clone would also set up it for emulating EM or HID prox or anything like that. And there's some example videos of how that's done elsewhere we can link to. But the whole point here is that the T5577 chip, no matter what product it's in, whether it's an XEM or a Next or a FlexEM or any other of our products that use it, it is a very powerful low frequency 125 kilohertz chip that can basically be used to emulate or clone a number of different types of fobs, cards, and badges. The site might be called Dangerous Things, but remember, safety first.